Oh yeah, I had a big change in beliefs. I went from infralapsarian Calvinism to supralapsarian Calvinism. Hey guys, welcome back to KingdomCraft, where we build churches in Minecraft while talking about Christianity. Today, I'm going to go on a journey to mine some andesite while I talk about my theological journey in the past 2 years. So 2 years ago, I made a video about my theological journey from being a secular leftist to being a progressive Christian to being a traditional Presbyterian. So, I changed a lot. But since then, I've barely changed at all. I've stayed the exact same denomination, PCUSA Presbyterian, and I only changed my mind on one issue, which I'll talk about. The rest of it was just changes in perspective that I had, or new things that I learned. But yeah, that's what I'm going to be talking about while I go on a trip to mine some andesite. The reason I need to go somewhere else to mine andesite is because this Minecraft server is 10 years old. It's over 10 years old. And when this settlement was developed, andesite did not exist in the game yet, so I have to go to some more newly generated terrain to mine some andesite. So that'll give me an opportunity to travel all around the Presbyterian country of Tridonia on this Christian Minecraft server, and you'll get to see all the Presbyterian churches that have been built recently. I've heard a lot of new Presbyterian churches have been built all over this Minecraft country. So, we are starting off in the summer of 2023 when I made my last video about my theological journey. That's when we're starting off. So, back then, that was when my YouTube channel had just gotten big for the first time. And that was when I had just started the Reconquista movement. The Reconquista movement was the movement I started to retake the liberalized mainline Protestant churches and make them Protestant again. So back then, I didn't know as much theology as I do now, but I had a basic understanding of Reformed beliefs. My theology knowledge back then was mostly secondhand, though. It was mostly from podcasts and other secondhand sources, and not from primary sources. I had read all the Reformed confessions, so I knew enough to know that the PCUSA wasn't following its own beliefs and needed to be retaken, but I hadn't really read the Church Fathers or any of the writings of the Reformers outside the confessions. So my knowledge back then was pretty limited. Okay, here's a nice new church. This is a nice new church. A new Presbyterian church in this Minecraft server. So yeah, so we are starting off in the summer of 2023. So, I was talking about the Reconquista online a lot and how we need to retake these old institutions of the Protestant heritage because we should retake them rather than running away and letting leftists have them, letting leftists take them over, because they're an important part of our heritage. And I noticed some people were saying, no, we should just split off from them and start new institutions. A lot of people who were saying this were presuppositionalists. What's a presuppositionalist? Presuppositionalism is an approach to apologetics and philosophy where you presuppose your own worldview and show inconsistencies in other worldviews, as opposed to the more classic Christian or Thomist way of doing things, where you do appeal to some neutral standards or some self-evident principles about reality. And I noticed the Reformed tradition was divided over whether to follow Thomas Aquinas or presuppositionalism, which is started by Cornelius Van Til when it comes to epistemology and when it comes to theology. Okay, I think this cow is a presuppositionalist because he is blocking my path. Anyway, this rail was also made this rail was made in 2017. I remember making this rail in 2017, so this rail is not very well developed. But yeah, so a lot of the presuppositionalists were actually against the Reconquista. They said it would be better to just start new institutions. I would say we need to retake these great Protestant institutions like Harvard and Yale and Princeton, and they'd be like, no, we can just start new institutions like Doug Wilson did. He started New St. Andrews College. And I would tell these presuppositionalists, I'm sorry, Doug Wilson's tiny liberal arts school is not nearly as highly rated as Harvard and Yale and Princeton, which were once great Calvinist institutions. And then the presuppositionalists would pull their old mantra saying, by what standard can you say that Harvard is better than Doug Wilson's tiny college? Are you using evil secular standards? And that's what made me gravitate more towards, Thomism and classical Reformed theology over presuppositionalism, because I think, yeah, we do need some neutral, objective standards to appeal to so that the church can impress the world. For example, this is a very impressive new Presbyterian church on this Christian Minecraft server. I think the church should impress the world. Jesus says we are to be a light to the rest of the world. Now, I'm not saying presuppositionalists say that we shouldn't, but I began to notice that presuppositionalists consistently didn't support the Reconquista because they didn't really care how objectively impressive their schismatic institutions were as long as it met their own worldview. So even if that's not the intention, I noticed that presuppositionalism led to a lot of retreatism and ghettoization of Christians, and R.C. Sproul, who is not a presuppositionalist, made the exact same critique. So I noticed that the Reformed theology world was divided into two main camps, really. There was the classical Reformed theologians, like R.C. Sproul, and then the presuppositionalists, like Doug Wilson. And I also knew about one third option. There was Karl Barth and the whole Neoorthodox camp. Now, I had avoided Barth mostly because a lot of other people told me that Barth was like halfway liberal, but I was curious about him because he was neither a classical Reformed theologian nor a presuppositionalist. He was part of the Neo-Orthodox camp. And I noticed that Barth actually disagreed with Van Til on one critical issue. Van Til, the father of presuppositionalism, said that strictly, the incarnation of Christ is just a response to human sin. If we had not sinned, then Christ would not have had to come incarnate. Whereas Barth said the whole world was made for the incarnation of Christ. So Barth seemed to have more of a Christocentric view, right? So I sided more with Barth than Van Til on that issue, or with Thomas Aquinas. Because Thomas Aquinas also said the incarnation of Christ was just a remedy for the sin of Adam. And there was a contemporary of Thomas Aquinas, I learned, Duns Scotus, who took Barth's view that the world was created for the incarnation of Christ. But I didn't really go in depth into that issue at that time. At the time, I was just focused on the Reconquista and working through presuppositionalism and realizing why I don't agree with it. That was all I was thinking about around summer 2023. So I made a video in summer 2023 about the three camps within Reformed theology: the classical approach, the presuppositional approach, and the neo-orthodox approach. The classical being based on the ideas of Thomas Aquinas, presuppositionalism being based on Van Til, and neo-orthodoxy being based on Karl Barth. And I said in that video that I would probably be somewhere in between Thomas Aquinas and Karl Barth. So back then, I hadn't read any Karl Barth, and I was a bit skeptical of Karl Barth, but I was... Okay, I'm turning off the chat. My server is so stupid. I was for sure curious about Karl Barth. And speaking of my server being stupid, that actually started to change some of my feelings about things. It didn't really change my beliefs, but it did change some of my attitudes, at least for a while. So I did open this Minecraft server to the public in 2023, once my channel became quite a bit bigger. I didn't create my Discord server, though. My Discord server was created by people within this Minecraft server. And for several months, I was, like, nominally the owner of the Discord server. I was technically the owner in terms of the administration permissions, but I didn't manage it. I left the management to the people who actually made the server. And I began to get complaints about my Discord server. I didn't know how to address them because I didn't really know how Discord worked at that time. But I began to get complaints from some people saying that this Discord server was being run by a lot of Catholics and Eastern Orthodox people who would become the mods of the server and use the server as a means to try and convert Protestants away from Protestantism. But at that time, I was very ecumenical. I was like, so what? They're still Christians. I don't really care if people leave Protestantism as long as they stay Christian. But then, after enough times, I began to see my Discord server was really getting crazy. Once I actually looked into it, I began to see some pretty strange rules in the server, like stop posting the twerking duck, or stop posting the pooping rhino, or like stop acting like a femboy or whatever. And I was like, what sort of degeneracy is happening in this Discord server with my name on it? And in addition to all that, I began to see a lot of blatant disrespect towards Protestants in the Discord server. So I started to intervene and say, hey guys, can you maybe stop disrespecting Protestants? Thanks. And then I received a lot of backlash for making those pretty innocent statements on my own Discord server, it resulted in like many months of nonstop Discord drama, which I really wish hadn't happened because that's not productive at all. But basically, because of that, my attitude towards Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy temporarily got a bit worse. And I jumped into the sort of Protestant apologetics scene to try and defend Protestantism in debate. Now, in hindsight, I shouldn't have done this, because like I said back then, in like late 2023, I hadn't really read any of the Church Fathers, and if you're gonna debate Catholicism or Orthodoxy as a Protestant, you have to have read the Church Fathers. So I did a few debates that I didn't do that well in, and the Catholics and Orthodox people in my server sure let me know, which only aggravated the tensions between me and those communities. So around January 2024, I was like, okay, I need to actually learn my stuff if I'm going to be a good Protestant apologist. So for the first time ever, I started really reading the Church Fathers. Previously, I'd read like Athanasius on the Incarnation and part of Augustine's Confessions, but that was literally it. It didn't go deeper than that. So in early 2024, I would read a different Church Father book every week. I got through like 30 different Church Father volumes in just one semester. I began reading the medieval scholastics like Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus and Bonaventure. I began to get really into Reformed scholasticism. So the scholastic Protestant era was like right after the Reformation. The Reformation was in the 1500s when the Reformers did the reforming. And then the Scholastic era was after that, where the sort of next generation of people in the Protestant churches defended the decisions and the actions and the beliefs of the Reformers, and they appealed to medieval scholasticism to do so. So the 1600s were the era of flourishing of Reformed and Lutheran and Catholic scholastics. So I read lots of Reformed and Lutheran scholastics. I read Gerhardt for the Lutherans, and then for the Reformed, I read Turretin and Maastricht and Perkins and Butchus and Rutherford and Zanke and all those people. So I started calling myself like a Reformed scholastic because I was really into those guys. And the Reformed scholastics presented much better arguments for Protestantism than I had heard from pop apologetics content creators like James White and stuff. Because most pop Protestant apologists are really just Baptist apologists. You know, they don't actually know the depth of the Reformed tradition. So once I started reading the Reformed scholastics, I became familiar with much more nuanced and better arguments for the Reformed tradition. And once I started reading the Church Fathers, I began to be more confident in my Protestant beliefs because I was like, hey, the Church Fathers don't seem to be, they're clearly not Protestants, but they don't seem to be Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. So that kind of indicates what the Protestants are saying, where there's a branch theory and all the traditions just organically evolved out of the sort of early church. And the Church Fathers did believe strongly in some things. They weren't relativists, but what they defined as the faith was the stuff that all the different denominations agree on. They didn't define, like, having bishops as part of the faith delivered from the apostles. And they did have bishops, but that wasn't considered an essential doctrine. They did make a distinction between essential and non-essential doctrines, just like Protestants do. So yeah, the next big era of my theological development was getting into Reformed scholasticism. But that didn't really change any of my beliefs, it just gave me a new perspective. The thing I did change my beliefs on was Infralapsarianism versus Superlapsarianism. So in my 2023 videos, I made a big error by saying that Infralapsarianism is nice Calvinism and Superlapsarianism is mean Calvinism. At that time, I thought Infralapsarianism is where God just passes over the non-elect, doesn't actively create them for damnation, and Superlapsarianism, I thought, was basically equal ultimacy, where God saving people and damning people is like equal, where God equally predestines some people to heaven unconditionally and equally predestines other people to hell unconditionally. That's what I thought Superlapsarianism was. But once I read the Reformed scholastics, I realized many of them were Superlapsarian, and that's not what they meant by Superlapsarianism. They did not believe that God created people just for the sake of damning them. I realized that there is a distinction. There's a scholastic distinction between reprobation and damnation. Reprobation is God's decree to not give saving grace. Damnation is when God sends people to hell. And damnation is only based on people's sins. God does not damn anyone unconditionally, not even in Superlapsarian Calvinism. So there were a lot of Superlapsarian scholastics that I really respected, like William Perkins, and Samuel Rutherford and Gisbertus Vuccis. And then there was sort of Petrus von Maastricht, who had a sort of sandwich lapsarian view, where corporate election is superlapsarian and then individual election is infralapsarian. And I noticed among the medieval scholastics, Thomas Aquinas was infralapsarian, but Duns Scotus, that guy who agreed with Karl Barth on the Incarnation and had a very Christocentric view, was a supralapsarian. So I started rethinking superlapsarianism. So I spent like a whole month just researching that issue, and it's convenient. I built this church. This church is built after the church where I married my wife. I'm calling it St. Zwingli's Presbyterian Church because she's PCA. And it was right after I got engaged, actually, that I started really studying this issue. Really studying the issue of infralapsarianism versus superlapsarianism. So I have very good memories associated with superlapsarianism. Anyway, that was happening in like the middle of 2024. I realized superlapsarianism is actually more Christocentric, because Duns Scotus was a superlapsarian because he believed the world was created for the incarnation of Christ. So Thomas Aquinas, who was infralapsarian, believed that the incarnation of Christ is just a response to the fall. In other words, the incarnation of Christ for Thomas is infralapsarian, because the word infralapsarian means below the fall, logically. So Thomas Aquinas believed the incarnation is logically below the fall in terms of the order of God's decrees, where God only decrees to have Christ come incarnate in light of the fall. And Thomas Aquinas believed the same thing about predestination. So he believed in an infralapsarian incarnation and infralapsarian predestination. Thomas Aquinas believed predestination is in light of the fall, and the incarnation of Christ is also in light of the fall. Duns Scotus didn't believe either of those things. Duns Scotus believed that the incarnation of Christ would have happened even irrespective of the fall, because the world was created for the incarnation of Christ. So Scotus believed the incarnation is not in light of the fall, and neither is predestination. So that's why Scotus was a superlapsarian in terms of the incarnation and predestination. Now, briefly, I wondered, okay, can I be like an infralapsarian on predestination and superlapsarian on the incarnation? But I realized that was incoherent. And then I learned that Karl Barth, who, as we said in the beginning, also believed that the world was created for the incarnation of Christ, I learned that Karl Barth was also a superlapsarian. So I changed my view from infralapsarianism to superlapsarian. That's the one thing I changed my opinion on in these past 2 years. I went from infralapsarian Calvinism to superlapsarian Calvinism. Now, there was one other thing I almost changed my mind on, but I didn't. I almost gave up on the Reconquista, because a year ago was when the dreaded Olympia Overture was happening. The Olympia Overture was this motion in my denomination, the PCUSA, that was proposed by Olympia Presbytery, and the intention of it was to kick out conservative pastors from the denomination. And for many months, it looked like that was going to happen. So I started blackpilling, and I started preparing to leave the PCUSA. My wife and I decided to start attending a PCA church once we got married. It was a very good PCA church that we had in mind. And once we got married, we started actually attending this PCA church. And I wasn't going to change my membership yet, but once we married, we moved to a new place, and I didn't know of any good PCUSA churches in the area. So I was like, yeah, maybe I'll go to a PCUSA church in the future, but for now, I'm attending a PCA church. So I almost gave up on the Reconquista because I was really blackpilling about all of it. But once General Assembly actually rolled around, it turned out that the Olympia Overture wasn't going to be as bad as we thought. The Olympia Overture requires candidates to state their views on LGBT, but doesn't require them to affirm LGBT. Now, this will be used to kick out non-LGBT affirming pastors from liberal presbyteries, but the liberal presbyteries were already doing that. So, in effect, the Olympia Overture doesn't change much. It doesn't change anything, really. So I kind of stopped blackpilling about the Reconquista, but I was still kind of discouraged. It wasn't going that well. And I was just thinking, I'll start just diving deeper into the Reformed tradition. Maybe I'll eventually join the PCA. And I even told some people like Matthew Everhart, who's a prominent PCA YouTuber and a good friend of mine, yeah, I might end up joining the PCA. So I began to just continue studying scholasticism and Reformed theology, and I got this one book this one book from my school's mainline seminary library, because my school is a historically mainline Protestant school. Now my college is just as Christian as like Harvard is. It's a historically Christian school, not really anymore. But that means it still has a mainline Protestant seminary library with tons of really, really niche books that you would never even think to look for in an evangelical seminary library, that you would not be able to find there. So this one book, the book was called The Evangelical Mind and the New School Presbyterian Mindset. This book was just a history of New School Presbyterianism, because in the 1800s, the Presbyterian Church split into the Old School and the New School and eventually reconciled. Now, the actual thesis of this book was irrelevant, kind of. What mattered was the history that this book told, the history of the Presbyterian Church. And what the book was actually trying to communicate, that's not what was relevant to my personal experience. What really struck me was just how theologically and culturally rich the Presbyterian heritage of the 1800s was. I was reading this random book about a random split in the Presbyterian Church from 150 years ago that got resolved over 100 years ago. And I wasn't even really thinking about whether the old school or the new school was correct. I was just struck by how much was going on in the Presbyterian Church back then, how much rich theology everyone was doing, how much of a cultural impact the Presbyterian Church had on American culture back then. Back then, it's according to that book, I learned that it used to be the majority of professors at most high-level American universities were confessional Presbyterians. Back then, I learned that all Presbyterian fathers would catechize their kids with the Westminster Shorter Catechism. Nowadays, most Presbyterian fathers don't do that, but back then, the Presbyterian Church was super dedicated to the education, not just of their own children, but of the entire country. They were involved in the culture. They weren't retreating from the culture. They were starting mission agencies right and left to help the poor and to help culture develop and to help culture become more Christianized. Both sides, both old school and new school, were doing it, by the way. So, who is right in the old school, new school split is irrelevant because they were both so much cooler than any church is today. So that basically ended my whole flirting with retreatism. That ended my blackpilling about the mainline. Because when I was reading that book about how the institutional Presbyterian Church used to be, I realized that we cannot get this back unless we revive our heritage. And whether we like it or not, the heritage is present in the mainline Presbyterian Church, not in the PCA. The PCA has been disconnected from this heritage. The PCA does preserve some of the theological ideas of the Presbyterian Church, but the heritage is more than just theological ideas. It's also these institutions that I kept reading about, that faithful men started over the centuries, that they put their heart and soul into, these institutions that had a really tangible impact on America for God's kingdom. Kingdom theology asserts that the kingdom of God is more than just individuals plus ideas. It's also individuals and their ideas and the impact that those ideas have on the physical world. We're not Gnostics here. So that made me realize, okay, I can't actually join the PCA. I'm not going to do that. I have to retake the PCUSA because that's what contains the Presbyterian heritage. So if in early 2024, that was my phase being obsessed with Reformed scholasticism, then late 2024 was my phase being obsessed with Presbyterian theology. So I began diving deep into the Princeton theologians like Charles Hodge and William G.T. Shedd, and some other Southern Presbyterians like Robert Louis Dabney, even though the Princeton ones were obviously Northern theologians. And I noticed that even though the theology of the PCA is very closely based on the Princeton theologians like Hodge and Warfield, they also believed a lot in supporting secular science, which the PCA largely doesn't. The PCA is mostly young earth creationist, except for Tim Keller. Charles Hodge and B.B. Warfield were not young earth creationists. They were mainline Protestants. They said that if science reveals new things about the world, we should adjust our interpretation of Scripture to meet that. That is not something you will hear in the PCA or any evangelical church for that matter. So I began becoming much more mainline pilled than I ever had before. In 2024, I had a brief flirtation with the retreatist mindset. I considered leaving the PCUSA, but then I was like, nope. I bounced back more Reconquista pilled than I ever had been before, especially because of something I read while I was studying these Presbyterian theologians. So in addition to studying the Princeton theologians, I studied the Scottish Covenanters. The Scottish Covenanters are basically like the theological fathers of Presbyterianism as a distinct theological tradition. The four main Scottish Westminster divines were George Gillespie, Samuel Rutherford, Robert Bailey, and Alexander Henderson. So they are Reformed scholastics, but they are like distinctively Presbyterian Reformed scholastics. Most of the Reformed scholastics you study, like Churiton or Maastricht, are just general Calvinists, not necessarily distinctively Presbyterian. And I have a other video going over the distinctives between like Presbyterian versus just generally Reformed. But one of them, Robert Bailey, as I was doing a deep dive into his works, said something that is very, very interesting. Robert Bailey has this work, A Dissuasive Against the Errors of Our Time, particularly of the Independents. The Independents were these basically non-denominationals of 1600s England. And he writes against all the things that they did back then, which are identical to non-denominationals today. They were being very anti-intellectual, they were being just reactionary anti-Catholic. He even said their clothing was not appropriate for worship, which I would say of most non-denominational pastors and churches today. But he said another thing they do is church hopping. He says they will leave any church they think isn't sufficiently pure. Then Robert Bailey says something that not only condemns non-denominationals, but also condemns the PCA and the OPC and the EPC and ECO and all the other Presbyterians who have split from the mainline church. He says, heresy does not justify voluntary schism. Robert Bailey says that in 1 Corinthians, there was blasphemy of the Eucharist, and in Galatians, they were preaching a false gospel. They were being heretical. In the churches of Laodicea, the lampstand is threatened to be removed. And these are Bailey's exact words. But from none of those churches did any of the apostles ever separate, nor gave they the least warrant to any of their disciples to make a separation from any of them. Now, everyone says, what about Luther? He split from the church. Well, no, he did not voluntarily split from the church. He did not want to leave the Catholic Church. He was forcibly kicked out. He was excommunicated and threatened with death. That did not happen to any people in the PCA. Not even J. Gresham Machen was excommunicated. He was fired. He wasn't excommunicated, though. And even if he needed a job as a pastor, there were a bunch of other denominations that already existed that he could have gotten ordained in. He didn't need to start a brand new denomination. So that really, really put the nail in the coffin of any chance of me joining the PCA. That made me, I used to believe, I guess this is another thing I changed my mind on. I used to believe that schism from the PCUSA was a valid option, just not strategically advantageous for the kingdom. But then I became a lot more extreme in my Reconquista beliefs, and believed that schism from the mainline church is actually sinful. Voluntary schism is sinful, and basically all of the church fathers believed this as well. So I began to think, the origins of the PCA are sinful. So the PCA can be beneficial to God's kingdom in the long run if it rejoins the PCUSA, but on its own, it cannot and will not revive the Reformed heritage. So I felt just this spiritual prompting to actually investigate the nearby churches, the nearby PCUSA churches, to see if any of them were actually good. I had heard that all the PCUSA churches in my area were liberal, which is why I began attending a PCA for a few months. But I thought, why don't I check for myself? So I checked one PCUSA church, and it sucked. But then I checked the second PCUSA church, and it was great, and that's where I'm actually becoming a member of right now. So the last thing that really changed for me, last two things. So while I was reading through this all this Presbyterian literature, I came across John Williamson Nevin once again. Now, several years before, I had read John Williamson Nevin's book defending the truly Reformed view of the Eucharist, where we actually do believe in spiritual real presence, and I loved it. But this time, I began to go into Nevin's other works, and Nevin has a really great work also against voluntary schism. It's called Antichrist, or the Spirit of Sect and Schism, and Nevin literally predicts the PCA in that work. He says that if you split from the mainline church, you're going to not care about the sacraments, your Christology is going to become Nestorian. He even goes so far as to say your music is going to suck, and the tunes that the lyrics of the music is set to is also going to suck. You know, I've had many PCA friends go Roman Catholic because the worship style of the PCA is just so evangelical. Nevin is this German idealist who talks a lot about the organic evolution of things. And he says that if you sever yourself from the organic continuity of the mainline church institution, you're going to become very Anabaptist and evangelical in your mindset, even if that's not the intention. And you're going to have bad sacramentology and all that. So that really, really red-pilled me about the Reconquista even harder, and it made me realize why it's absolutely necessary. And I noticed that John Williamson Nevin was saying a lot of the same things that Karl Barth was saying a century earlier. So some people are, like, they like some of Barth's ideas, but they don't know what to do with them because Barth did have some personal moral failings. Now, Barth didn't actually have a physical affair, like people say. Barth basically had feelings for someone who was not his wife, which is not good, but he never acted on those feelings. Basically, Barth had a crush while being in an arranged marriage that he never wanted to do anyway, that he was forced into by his father. Is that good? No. I don't think that means we should cancel Barth, like some people say we should. Now, some people are still skeptical of Barth's ideas because of this, and I understand that, but I realized that a century before Barth even existed, John Williamson Nevin was saying almost exactly what Barth was saying, although I think Nevin puts it better. So I read the entire first volume of Barth's Church Dogmatics, which took me an entire year to read, but I noticed Nevin was saying many of the same things. One of Barth's ideas that Nevin also believes is that the contents of revelation from God, it's not the words of Scripture itself, it's Christ, and Scripture is the unique and authoritative witness to Christ. Another one of Barth's ideas that Nevin appropriates is the incarnation would have happened even if humanity had not sinned. A very Christocentric view of everything. So I became very John Williamson Nevin-pilled. This is around the end of 2024. So now moving into 2025, once I had read tons of Karl Barth, once I had read tons of, John Williamson Nevin, and once I had read tons of church fathers and tons of Reformed scholastics, I found a newfound confidence in the Protestant heritage and the Protestant tradition. Like I said, when I first stepped into Protestant apologetics, I didn't really know what I was talking about. I was just sort of doing it out of anger, basically. Basically out of anger against the Catholics and Orthodox in my Discord for being disrespectful to Protestants. I jumped into it way too early. So then about 6 months after that, I decided to back down from Protestant apologetics because I realized I was not the best person to do that. I just wanted to focus on the Reconquista. But then after that, once I sort of made up with the Catholic and Orthodox communities and tried to become ecumenical again, and once I found this newfound appreciation for the Protestant heritage, the Protestant tradition, I decided to step back into Protestant apologetics. So yeah, now I am once again a Protestant apologist, but this time I actually have read stuff and not just listened to podcasts. So that's been my theological journey over these past 2 years. I can already hear all of you guys typing in the comments section where you think the next stage of my theological journey is where I become Catholic, but I hate to disappoint you guys, that's not going to happen. So thank you guys for watching this video, and I will see you all later. God bless.